Hi, my name is Olivia McRae, and to start, I would like to acknowledge the Camaragal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land that I am presenting from today. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to the traditional custodians of the land that you are on today, and to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are present with us today. Today, I'd like to talk about building inclusivity in science communication through acknowledging multiple historical perspectives. For a little bit of context, I'm a first year PhD candidate in the Scope group at the University of Sydney, and my research focuses on how we can broaden participation in science engagement opportunities through using non-academic spaces. I have a particular focus in my research on young adults and on issues that have social and scientific dimensions. So an example of that would be climate change. You can find me on GitHub. My username is on the screen. And if you see this icon on any of my slides, that means there's a bit more information about that topic on my GitHub. So what's the relevance of this topic for education? Diverse representation of science and histories of science allows marginalized students to contextualize their own lived experience within science. It also offers richer opportunities for involvement because we're able to change the narrative about what science is and who science is for. It's important to note that there is no one thing that we can change that will make science an inclusive space for everybody, but rather multiple aspects of our practice that have to change. Acknowledging diverse histories of science and science communication is one of these aspects of our practice that can change to make science more inclusive for everybody. In this presentation, I'll be using this definition of science communication. So this has the public at the center as either audiences or participants who have one or more of the following reactions to science. And this follows an AEIOU vowel analogy. So that is awareness, enjoyment, interest, opinion forming, and understanding. I'd like to quickly look at a brief history of science communication that you might see in the literature. So if we look on the right-hand side of this timeline, we can see the narrative that happens in the science communication literature more recently. So science communication as a research field is relatively new, and it's mostly being characterized by the emergence of this model called the public understanding of science in 1985, followed by a dialogue model which emerged around the late 90s, early 2000s. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. Before science communication was a research field, there was a history of science being popularized in society in the late 17th century, early 18th century. There are a number of figures that were popularizing science at the time, and there's evidence that there are a number of SciComm-like activities that were common across many parts of Europe. So things like books and science shows, public lectures. However, the history in the literature rarely goes beyond this European history and a history that starts earlier than the Enlightenment period. The more recent narrative about science communication mostly follows this deficit to dialogue narrative. So this is a shift from a deficit approach, which is one-way communication from scientists to the public, shifting to a dialogue approach, which is two-way communication or communication between multiple participant groups. This has certainly been influential in science communication, but it emerged from the UK specifically, and it is not reflective of the science communication landscape in many countries, and not even of science communication across Europe. So as an example, Denmark has done almost the opposite, where they've gone from a dialogue to a more deficit approach. In the 1980s in Denmark, there was a popular model called the consensus conference model, which was a way of discussing scientific issues with society. And that became less popular over time. And now there are more approaches to science communication in Denmark that are in line with deficit style approaches. So by only acknowledging this deficit to dialogue narrative, we're excluding countries and practices that don't follow this narrative. To understand a bit more about the impacts of a Eurocentric lens on science, it's important to understand the origins of Western science. So science became institutionalized in Europe in about the 1800s, and this was a society where there were quite racist, sexist, and classist ideas. When science became institutionalized, it was mostly the realm of wealthy white men, and the academy excluded people who were not wealthy, not white, and not men. With this new position of power in the academy, these people now had a tool that they could use to provide evidence for their own beliefs and biases about how society should be structured. And an example of this is craniology, which is the measurement of skulls. Samuel Morton was one of those scientists who did this at the time. And what he found was that women had smaller skulls than men, and people of African descent had smaller skulls than people of European descent. Now, while those findings of the sizes of the skulls were technically correct, his own biases colored his interpretations. So he interpreted that to mean smaller skulls mean smaller brains, which means that people with smaller skulls were less intelligent, and used this to justify that they should be in a lower position in society. These origins of Western science have dictated who has historically been allowed to participate in science, and still prevents marginalized communities from participating in science today. The dominant narrative of science is still overwhelmingly male and white, and this sends a message to marginalized communities that science is not for them, and that even if they wanted to participate, there isn't a place in science either. I've been looking mostly at Western lenses so far, and I'd like to look at some alternative lenses, which is important to consider when you're talking about diversifying the histories that we talk about in science and science communication. So science communication has been characterized as something that happens in Western countries because it has used historically similar communication methods, so things like books, science shows. It's knowledge that came from or involved professionalized science in some way, and it had the public, as in those outside of the academy, as an audience. In comparison, traditional knowledge is a knowledge, practice, belief system. It's dynamic and changing. That's not to say that Western science is not dynamic and changing. It's just that traditional knowledge is often characterized as being static and belonging to the past, which is not the case. It's orally transmitted from generation to generation, and it's produced from a close and continuing relationship with the environment. So that means that often this knowledge is time deep, but maybe fairly localized. As part of this presentation, I'd like to highlight some alternative histories of science communication. And the first one that I'd like to look at is this oral history from the Yorta Yorta Nation. So this is an oral history of a geological event that happened 30,000 years ago that was witnessed by Yorta Yorta ancestors and passed down from generation to generation. So what happened was that there was this Cadell fault line labeled as the Cadell tilt block on this map here. And this changed the course of the Murray River. So the Murray River used to run along the top here. And when that fault line lifted up, it created a barrier where the Murray River used to run. It flooded this area, which is labeled as the Barmah Fan. So that's now the Barmah Willowa wetlands. And the Murray River rerouted to go along the bottom here. So this has been this is a history that extends far beyond that history that we saw in that original timeline, which focused around Europe. And it has also been adapted in recent times. So there's videos of this oral history that are published online, and it's also told to audiences who come to visit Yorta Yorta country. Another example that I'd like to highlight is Indian astronomy. And in particular, I'd like to highlight the Rig Veda. So the Vedas are a set of sacred Hindu texts, and they were written down, they started to get written down in around 1500 BCE. The Rig Veda mostly consists of Sanskrit hymns, but there was a section of the Rig Veda which contained astronomical knowledge, which was used as a calendar to determine when religious and cultural events should happen. They had their own algorithms that they used as to predict when certain astronomical events would happen so that they could set events for these dates. And these were corrected based on their own astronomical observations of what the sun and the stars and the moon were actually doing. Some of this astronomical knowledge was also known by the public, and an example of this is the phases of the moon. So most of the public knew and observed the phases of the moon, and this was important so that they could participate in monthly religious celebrations. So why is this important? Learning from multiple histories is a really big benefit for science communication. Hopefully what you've seen from this presentation is that the deficit to dialogue binary is very limiting in terms of what gets considered as science communication and excludes people who are outside of that. We've also seen that different approaches to science communication work in different contexts. And by learning from multiple histories, we have a broader set of approaches that we can use to design science communication initiatives for different contexts. It also helps to change the narrative about what science is and who science is for, and creates safer spaces for people to get involved because they're seeing a more diverse history of science and more diversity in science currently. So where can you start? This is something that I am still learning about, and these are some of the resources that have helped in my own education. If you have some resources that you'd like to share, I'd love to hear about them. The first one that I'd like to highlight is this book by Emily Dawson called Equity, Exclusion, and Everyday Science Learning. So this is a really good summary of the dynamics that exclude marginalized people from science and science communication. And there's also this illustrated zine edition, which is a great summary of her points in the book. It's also a really good idea to diversify who you follow on social media. And one place that I've found very useful for this is the Black in STEM hashtags on Twitter. And incidentally, the next one that's coming up is Black in SciComm. So that's starting on October 4th. And if you'd like to follow along with that, that's a great place to find diverse voices and amplify diverse voices in science communication. And the last one that I'd like to highlight is Amy Thunig. She's a Gramilliroy academic, and she has a podcast called Blackademia, which is also great. But I think she's good because she has lots of commentary which highlight some of the own biases that you might have about marginalized communities or the dynamics, the structural dynamics that cause exclusion. And I think this is a good place to start opening a conversation up with yourself and with other people around you about what in science is exclusive and how we can start to improve that. And as a challenge for you, I'd like you to think about a couple of things. So who do you think about when you think about a scientist? What kind of histories of science and science communication do you highlight? And do these people and these histories of science reflect where you want science to be in the future and what you want science to look like? And if it doesn't, how can you start to change that? I'd like to acknowledge my research group for their support in helping me put together this presentation, and in particular my supervisors Alice Motion and Rain Pullen for their help and feedback. If you have any questions for me, I'd love to hear about them in the discussion. You can find me on GitHub, or if you want to get in contact with me later, you can also email me. Thank you.